The call came in at 2:47 a.m. The dispatcher's voice buzzed through my radio, urgent but steady, like she was trying to mask the underlying tension. Unit 237, report to 8th and Hoover. Possible B&E, silent alarm triggered. I sighed, leaning back in the cruiser seat. My partner had called out sick, leaving me alone on the graveyard shift. The city was quiet, streets slick from an earlier rain. There wasn't much activity, which made the call feel out of place. Break-ins didn't usually happen in this area, not the kind that warranted alarms, anyway. But orders were orders. 10-4, I replied, flipping the siren lights on without the sound. The quiet streets didn't need any unnecessary drama. As I pulled up to the location, I realized it wasn't a business or residence. It was an abandoned warehouse, the kind that looked like it had been forgotten decades ago, left to rot alongside the graffiti-tagged walls and boarded-up windows. The building loomed over me, dark and imposing, with a single flickering streetlight casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I grabbed my flashlight and exited the cruiser, the heavy night air clinging to my skin. Something felt wrong. The place wasn't just abandoned, it was dead. No sounds, no stray animals, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just the soft crackle of the radio on my belt. Dispatch, I'm on scene, I said into the mic. Building looks abandoned. No sign of forced entry. Copy, 237. Proceed with caution. Backup is 15 minutes out. Backup? For a silent alarm? That was odd. But before I could question it, my flashlight beam caught something. The warehouse door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. It hadn't been broken, it was unlocked, pushed open just enough to invite someone in. I hesitated at the doorway. The warehouse loomed like a gaping maw, its interior swallowed in shadow. My flashlight's beam struggled to cut through the thick darkness. A faint, metallic smell hit me, sharp and sour, carried on the damp air. It wasn't blood, but it wasn't far off. Pushing the door wider, I stepped inside. The floor creaked underfoot, warped with age and moisture. My radio crackled faintly, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the occasional drip of water from somewhere deep inside. Dispatch, I'm entering the building. No sign of anyone yet, I whispered. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. Copy, 237. Keep me updated, came the reply. The first floor was a maze of rusted machinery and abandoned crates, like someone had tried to pack up in a hurry but never finished the job. My flashlight skimmed over old signs, faded with time. Henderson Manufacturing Company. A faint hum buzzed through the walls, like the building still had a heartbeat, though it should have been long dead. Then I heard it, a faint shuffle, like feet dragging across concrete, coming from somewhere above me. I froze, heart pounding. My hand went instinctively to my holster, drawing my gun. Police! I called out, my voice echoing against the cavernous walls. If someone's in here, make yourself known. Nothing. The shuffle stopped, replaced by a low creak, as if weight shifted on a loose floorboard. It was coming from the second floor. Adrenaline surged through me as I moved toward the metal staircase at the far end of the warehouse. Each step groaned under my boots, loud enough to make me wince. My flashlight flickered once, then stabilized. At the top of the stairs, the air was colder, like I'd crossed some invisible threshold. I scanned the second floor, a mostly open space with broken windows and scattered debris. But one thing stood out, a figure at the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadows. Stop right there, I shouted, training my flashlight and gun on the silhouette. Hands where I can see them. The figure didn't move. It stood unnaturally still, almost statuesque. Then, slowly, it turned toward me. My breath hitched. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. The face was featureless, like it had been smoothed over, with no eyes, no mouth, just pale, rubbery skin that glistened faintly under the light. Its head cocked to one side, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. Before I could react, it took a step forward, and the floor beneath it gave way. The figure plunged into the darkness below, and with it came a sound I'll never forget. A guttural, wet screech, like metal scraping bone. The screech reverberated through the warehouse, freezing me in place. I stared at the gaping hole where the figure had fallen, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Dispatch, I managed, my voice dry and cracking. I need immediate backup at my location. Someone's here. They fell through the floor. There was a long pause before the response came. 237. Clarify. You're saying there's an individual inside the building? Are you safe? Safe? I didn't even know what I had seen. My brain struggled to categorize it, to file it under anything remotely human. My words faltered as the noise started again, this time below me. A scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across concrete. I aimed my flashlight down the hole. The beam didn't reach far, just enough to catch movement. Something shifted, slithering just beyond the light's edge. I tightened my grip on my gun, aiming into the dark. "Come out where I can see you," I barked. The sound stopped abruptly. For a few long seconds, the silence felt unbearable, like the entire warehouse was holding its breath. Then, a new sound, laughter. Not loud or manic, but quiet and echoing, as if it came from several voices at once. I stumbled back, my boot catching on a broken board. The laughter grew louder, filling the space, bouncing off the walls until it felt like it was coming from everywhere. My flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't recover. Darkness swallowed me whole. "Dispatch!" I yelled, panic breaking through my professional tone. The radio went dead, just static. Then the laughter stopped. Behind me, something creaked. I spun around, gun raised, but there was nothing there, only empty space. My breath was ragged, and my pulse pounded in my ears as I edged toward the stairs. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I started to descend, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding my gun steady. Halfway down, the door to the warehouse slammed shut with a deafening bang. My heart jumped into my throat. The scraping sound started again, now directly below me, like it was circling the base of the stairs. I aimed my flashlight, but it was useless. The faint emergency light from my cruiser outside barely illuminated the ground floor. Then I saw it. Not one figure, but several. They moved in a disjointed, unnatural way, their limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. Their faces, none of them had faces, just blank, featureless skin. They were coming closer. I didn't think. I just ran. Down the stairs, past the figures, and toward the door. My shoulder slammed into it, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. How? I'd left it open. The figures were behind me now. I could hear their uneven, wet footsteps and the faint rustling of fabric, like old clothes dragging along the floor. Desperation took over. I smashed my flashlight against the door's glass panel, shattering it. As I reached through to unlock it, a cold, rubbery hand clamped around my wrist. I screamed, pulling free, the grip unnaturally strong and icy to the touch. Twisting, I saw one of the figures standing inches away, its head tilted, observing me with what I could only describe as malice. I fired my gun point blank. The figure crumpled, but there was no blood, just a thick, black liquid seeping from the wound. The others paused, then tilted their heads in unison. The air filled with that laughter again, louder now, like it was mocking me. I didn't wait. I threw open the door and sprinted to my cruiser, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The warehouse stood silent, its broken windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. I filed my report, leaving out most of the details. How could I explain what I'd seen? I told them I'd investigated the alarm, found signs of trespassers, and encountered a dangerous individual. That much was true. The rest, I didn't even know how to put into words. But when I checked back later, there was no record of the alarm. Dispatch claimed they'd never received my call. Even the footage from my body cam was corrupted, reduced to static and faint, distorted laughter. The warehouse was demolished a month later, erased like the whole thing had never happened. But I'll never forget the sound of that laughter, or the way those faceless things moved. I wasn't alone in there, and whatever they were, I don't think they were human. Couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their blank faces, their jerking limbs, and the glint of the black liquid oozing onto the warehouse floor. The laughter echoed in my ears long after it had faded into memory. By dawn, I knew I had to figure out what had happened. Even if it didn't make sense, even if it was impossible, I needed answers. The warehouse might have been demolished, but something told me the story didn't end there. At the station, I pulled every report related to the warehouse. Break-ins, missing persons, anything. What I found was sparse, too sparse. The warehouse had a history of vagrants and urban explorers, but every record seemed to end abruptly, as if someone had gone through the files with a red pen. Even more disturbing were the complaints. Multiple reports of strange noises, sightings of figures in the windows, and unexplainable lights, all dismissed as urban legends. But one entry caught my eye. A handwritten note in the margin of an old incident report. Check with Tartarus Archive. I'd heard the term before, a whispered rumor among officers about a restricted database. The kind of thing only high-clearance detectives and federal agents could access. Files too sensitive, too strange, or too dangerous for public record. I approached Officer Dunn, one of the few people I trusted at the station. He'd been around long enough to know the ins and outs of the system, and he had a reputation for poking his nose where it didn't belong. "Dunn," I said, keeping my voice low, "you ever hear about the Tartarus Archive?" His expression darkened instantly. "Where'd you hear that name?" I hesitated. It was in an old report. About the warehouse on 8th and Hoover. He glanced around the break room, making sure no one was listening. "Listen, I don't know much and I don't want to know much. But that archive is not just for unsolved cases. It's for things that don't make sense. Stuff that would make people panic if they knew about it. Ghost stories, monsters, cults. You don't go looking for Tartarus unless you want trouble. But it's real." Depressed. He nodded grimly. "Real enough that people disappear after asking too many questions about it. If you're smart, you'll let it go." The air inside was cold, almost freezing, and the hum of servers filled the space. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the distance, each packed with files, tapes, and hard drives. Monitors lined the walls, displaying grainy footage of street corners, forests, and empty rooms. One screen caught my attention, a static-filled feed of the warehouse on 8th and Hoover, dated 5 years ago. In the footage, the door swung open, and a faceless figure shuffled into the street. "Can I help you?" a voice called. I spun around. A man in a suit stood behind me, his expression unreadable. He wasn't wearing a badge, but his presence screamed authority. My mind raced for an excuse. "I'm investigating an incident tied to this location. Just following a lead." The man's eyes narrowed. "Your name?" I hesitated. Something told me he already knew it. "I think you should leave," he said finally, his voice cold. "This isn't a place for beat cops to wander. Forget you saw this room. Back in my cruiser, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That man, his expression, the way the door buzzed open without explanation. It all felt wrong. When I returned to the station, my computer access had been revoked. My supervisor pulled me into his office, claiming my curiosity about the Tartarus Archive had been flagged as a security concern. "You're off the case," he said, sliding a stack of reassignment paperwork across his desk. "And a word of advice? Some doors are locked for a reason. Don't go opening them." But the worst came that night. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or we'll bury you." Attached was a single image, a still frame from my body cam footage, showing the faceless figures from the warehouse. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Whoever they were, they knew everything, and they wanted me to forget. But how could I forget when I saw them every time I closed my eyes? Faceless, moving, waiting. I didn't let it go. The next day, I used the station's intranet to dig deeper. Most of my searches came up empty, blocked or restricted. But I found one breadcrumb, a location. The Tartarus Archive wasn't a digital database like I'd assumed. It was a physical place, buried in the basement of the City Records building. I took a chance and drove there, pretending I was running an errand. The building was old, the kind of municipal structure that reeked of mildew and forgotten bureaucracy. I wandered the halls until I found a nondescript metal door labeled "Restricted Access. Authorized personnel only." The lock was electronic. No keypad, no keyhole. Just a slot for an ID badge. I stood there for a long moment, my gut telling me this was a mistake. But before I could turn away, the door buzzed. It swung open on its own, the dim light from inside spilling out into the hallway. I stepped in. The message on my phone kept me awake all night. My every instinct screamed to let it go, to bury the memory of the faceless figures and the forbidden room deep in the back of my mind. But curiosity, or maybe pride, wouldn't let me. Something was guarding a truth far bigger than me, and they wanted me to stop asking questions. By morning, I decided to ignore the warning. Felt reckless, even suicidal, but if they were going to threaten me, they'd have to do more than send creepy texts. I made a list of names, officers who had worked that precinct over the years, people who might know something about the warehouse or the Tartarus archive. If I couldn't dig into official records, I'd dig into memories. The first name was Captain Hayes, retired 5 years ago. I found him in a quiet suburb, living in a small house that had seen better days. The lawn was overgrown, and the blinds were drawn tight. It was obvious he didn't get many visitors. I knocked 3 times before the door creaked open just a crack, enough for me to see a bloodshot eye peering out. "Who are you?" a gruff voice demanded. "Captain Hayes?" I asked. I know who you are," he interrupted, his voice low. "You're the one poking around where you shouldn't." I blinked, caught off guard. "How do you—" "They're watching you," he said. "Probably watching me now too." He stepped back, opening the door fully. "Get in before someone sees you." Inside, the house was cluttered, filled with stacks of newspapers and a heavy smell of cigarette smoke. Hayes gestured to a chair, but didn't sit himself. Instead, he paced the room, muttering under his breath. "I've been expecting someone like you," he said finally. "Sooner or later, someone always stumbles onto the Tartarus mess. Thought it had been long enough they'd buried it for good." I leaned forward. "What is it? What's in that archive?" Hayes stopped pacing and stared at me, his expression grim. "Things that shouldn't exist. Things we don't have words for, let alone answers. But the government, they don't like loose ends. So they lock them up in places like Tartarus. Erase them from the world." He pulled a flask from his pocket and took a long drink before continuing. "But some things don't stay buried. Like the warehouse. I saw it once years ago when I was still on the force. Got a call about strange lights, missing people. My team found. Well, let's just say we didn't go back." "What did you see?" I pressed. Hayes hesitated, his hand trembling slightly. "Faceless things," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Moving like they weren't meant to be here. They weren't attacking or hurting anyone, just watching, like they were studying us." I filed the report. Next day, the brass called me in, told me to drop it. Ordered me to sign a non-disclosure and transfer to another precinct. "Why didn't you fight it?" He laughed bitterly. "Because the ones who fight it disappear. You don't argue with the people running Tartarus. You survive them." As I left Hayes' house, I noticed an unmarked car parked down the street. Its windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but I felt the weight of its gaze. It didn't follow me, but its presence was a warning. I wasn't just being watched, I was being hunted. By the time I got home, paranoia had set in. I locked every door, closed every curtain, and left the lights off. My phone buzzed again, last warning. "Walk away." I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. Whoever they were, they had eyes everywhere. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I powered off my phone, grabbed a burner I'd kept for emergencies, and called an old tech-savvy friend. If I couldn't trust the system, I'd work outside it. That night, I met my friend in a dingy coffee shop across town. She'd pulled every scrap of data she could find on the warehouse and the Tartarus archive. Most of it was redacted, but one detail stood out. A series of unmarked black vans that had visited the warehouse months before its demolition. They weren't city vehicles, she said, scrolling through security footage. No plates, no insignias. Whoever they were, they didn't want to be traced. She paused, her expression darkening. But here's the kicker. The vans didn't just visit. They left with something. "What do you mean?" She turned the screen toward me. Grainy footage showed figures being loaded into the vans. Faceless figures. The implications hit me like a brick. The warehouse hadn't been demolished to destroy the faceless things. It had been a cover-up to move them. But to where and why? My friend hesitated, then pulled up another file. "This is from 2 nights ago. You said the warehouse was gone, right?" I nodded. Then explain this. The screen showed new footage, this time from a different location, an abandoned hospital across town. In the grainy night vision, faceless figures shuffled through the halls, their movements eerily familiar. They didn't stop, she said. They just moved. I couldn't stop thinking about the footage of the hospital. The faceless figures, their strange, disjointed movements, and the glow of that unnatural light in the grainy recording haunted me. They weren't contained, not even after the warehouse had been demolished. I had to see the place for myself, no matter the risks. I parked a block away from the hospital late that night. The massive building stood like a decaying sentinel against the dark sky. Its boarded-up windows and crumbling walls radiated abandonment, but the uneasy silence surrounding it felt alive, as if the hospital itself was watching me. The main entrance was chained shut, but a side door had been forced open, hanging slightly ajar. I slipped inside, flashlight in one hand, and my other resting on the grip of my holstered gun. The air was suffocatingly damp, reeking of mold and something sour. Water dripped somewhere deep within, echoing through the empty halls. The interior was a graveyard of forgotten equipment and yellowed patient records scattered across the floor. Gurneys lay overturned, their wheels locked in place by rust. The deeper I ventured, the heavier the silence became, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I followed the building's layout, moving toward the central wing where the figures had been recorded. Every step felt like it carried me further from the world outside. Then I saw them, tracks on the floor. Footprints, human but distorted, almost melted into the ground, like something too heavy had been dragging across the floor. My flashlight beam traced them to an operating theater at the end of the hallway. The door was cracked open, and faint light flickered inside, casting long shadows that danced against the walls. I pushed the door open with my foot, gun drawn, and stepped inside. The scene froze me in place. The faceless figures were there, standing in a loose circle around a pulsating, otherworldly machine. It looked like a mix between a crude mechanical device and a living organism, its tubes and wires writhing as they emitted a sickly yellow glow. The figures didn't move, their blank heads tilted slightly upward as if worshipping the grotesque creation. I took another step, the floor creaking beneath my boots. One of the figures turned toward me. It didn't have eyes, yet I felt its gaze bore into me. Then, in perfect unison, the others turned as well. Their featureless faces locked onto me, and the whispers began. Low, indistinct murmurs that came from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder with each passing second. I shouted, "Police! Don't move!" My voice sounded small, almost drowned by the whispers. They didn't respond, not in words. Instead, they stepped toward me, their movements jerky and inhuman. I fired my weapon, the sound deafening in the confined space. The closest figure staggered backward, black liquid spilling from the bullet wound. It didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. The others kept advancing, their movements accelerating, closing the distance between us faster than I thought possible. I backed away, firing again and again, but the bullets seemed to do nothing. The whispers rose to a roar, a cacophony of voices speaking a language I couldn't understand. I turned and ran, heart hammering as I burst out of the operating theater and into the dark hallway. The figures were right behind me, their footsteps a horrible, wet slapping against the ground. I rounded a corner, nearly slipping on the damp floor, and tripped over an overturned gurney. My flashlight skittered across the ground, casting wild beams of light that only made the shadows more menacing. I grabbed a rusted metal pipe nearby, swinging blindly as the first figure lunged at me. The impact sent it sprawling, its body crumpling like a rag doll, but it didn't stay down for long. I didn't wait to see more. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward the exit, my lungs burning and my legs trembling with every step. The whispers started to fade, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum, like the pulse of a giant, alien heart. I threw myself through the side door and collapsed onto the pavement outside, gasping for air. When I turned back, the doorway was empty. The hospital loomed silently, its darkened windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. As I stumbled to my car, I noticed them. Two men in suits leaning casually against the hood. They didn't move as I approached, their expressions unreadable, their presence radiating authority. One of them stepped forward, holding up a small device. Took me a moment to recognize it. My body cam. The footage I thought had been destroyed. Without a word, he pocketed the camera. "You've seen enough," he said coldly. "This isn't your concern anymore." I started to argue, but the other man raised a hand, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Walk away. That's the only advice we're giving you." I wanted to demand answers, to fight back, but the weight of their presence crushed any courage I had left. They opened my car door, a silent command, and I got in. When I looked in the rearview mirror as I drove away, the men were gone. So was the hospital. The lot where it had stood was empty, barren, as if the building had never existed at all. I don't sleep much anymore. The whispers haven't left me, nor have the faceless figures. Every shadow feels like a threat, every empty alley like a trap. I know they're still out there, whatever they are. And I know one thing for certain. They're not done with me yet. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had become a game of shadows. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, watchful, patient. The faceless figures, the men in suits, the hospital that had vanished without a trace. It all hung over me like a storm cloud waiting to burst. I tried to move on, tried to bury the memories under the weight of routine, but they wouldn't stay buried. One night, as I sat in my apartment reviewing an old case file, my burner phone buzzed. It wasn't a text this time. It was a call from an unknown number. My gut tightened as I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Against my better judgment, I picked up. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice came through, distorted and mechanical. "You've seen what you shouldn't. Now you'll see what comes next." The line went dead. Before I could process the message, my apartment's lights flickered and cut out entirely. I froze, heart pounding in the pitch-black silence. Outside, the faint hum of the city seemed muffled, distant. I grabbed my flashlight and gun, my hands trembling as I swept the beam across the room. Everything was where it should be, except for my front door. It was wide open. I hadn't heard it unlock, hadn't heard it move. But there it was, yawning into the dim hallway beyond. Slowly, cautiously, I approached, every instinct screaming at me to run. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. There was no response. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight cutting through the dark. It was empty, quiet, too quiet. The usual creaks and groans of the old building were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. As I turned to go back inside, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, something moved. Not walked, moved. A dark, shapeless mass slid along the floor, coiling and uncoiling like smoke with a will of its own. My flashlight flickered, struggling to hold its beam steady on the thing. It stopped. Then it rose. The mass shifted, solidifying into a tall, humanoid shape. Its head tilted, as if studying me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. My legs refused to move. I wanted to run, to scream, but all I could do was watch as it took a single, deliberate step forward. That's when the whispers started again. They came from everywhere at once, filling the hallway with a cacophony of voices. Some were frantic, pleading. Others were cold, commanding. They overlapped, growing louder and louder until they drowned out the sound of my own breathing. The figure took another step, and I finally found my legs. I bolted back into my apartment, slamming the door shut and locking it. My back pressed against the wood. I pointed my gun at the door, half expecting it to burst open. The whispers were louder now, seeping through the walls like they were alive. Then the lights came back on. The whispers stopped. Everything was quiet again, normal even. My apartment looked the same, untouched. But I knew better. Whatever had been in the hallway wasn't gone. It was waiting. I barely slept that night. When the sun rose, I left my apartment with a single goal: to disappear. I didn't pack much, just essentials and whatever cash I had on hand. I'd seen enough to know that staying in one place was no longer an option. But as I drove out of the city, a sinking realization hit me. You can run from people. You can run from places. But you can't run from the unknown. And the unknown was already inside me. I thought leaving the city would bring peace. I drove for hours, heading west along winding highways and empty backroads. The urban sprawl gave way to open fields, and the fields faded into dense, endless forests. My goal was simple: distance. The further I got from the city, from the warehouse, the hospital, and the faceless figures, the better. But the feeling never left me. The sense of being watched followed me like a shadow, persistent and unshakable. Every car that passed, every figure on the side of the road, every flicker in my rearview mirror, it all felt like a warning, or worse, a trap. By nightfall, I found myself in a small, nowhere town nestled in the woods. It had one motel, a rundown place with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. I parked my car in the gravel lot, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The man at the desk barely looked at me as he slid a key across the counter. Room 7. Last one on the end. The room smelled like mildew and cheap cleaner, but it had a lock on the door and no windows facing the road. That was good enough. I double-checked the lock, shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure, and collapsed onto the bed. Exhaustion finally overtook me, and for the first time in days, I drifted into a restless sleep. It didn't last long. I woke to the sound of whispers, faint at first, like they were coming from the far end of the room. My pulse quickened as I reached for my flashlight and gun. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus, coming from nowhere and everywhere. My hand trembled as I swept the beam across the room. Nothing, just the peeling wallpaper, the cheap furniture, and the shadow of the chair against the door. Then the light flickered, just once. A warning. I turned toward the corner of the room and froze. A figure stood there, tall and featureless, its blank face turned toward me. My flashlight's beam sputtered, and in the brief flashes of light, I saw it take a step forward. And another. The whispers were deafening now, pressing against my skull like a vice. I raised my gun and fired. The gunshot was deafening in the small room, but the figure didn't flinch. It kept coming, its movements impossibly smooth and deliberate. Black liquid oozed from where the bullet struck, pooling on the floor like ink. I scrambled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers turned to laughter, low and mocking, echoing inside my head. The figure reached the edge of the bed, its faceless head tilting as if to study me. Then it stopped. It didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, silent and still, as if frozen in time. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum. My flashlight flickered again, the beam steadying just long enough for me to see what was behind it. Another figure, and another. The room was filling with them, their faceless forms emerging from the shadows like smoke, solidifying into flesh. I didn't wait to see what came next. I grabbed my bag and bolted, shoving the chair aside and wrenching the door open. The hallway was empty, but the whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. I ran for the exit, my bare feet slamming against the cold tile floor. Outside, the night air hit me like a slap, sharp and cold. I sprinted to my car, my breath hitching as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. In the rearview mirror, the motel stood dark and silent, its neon sign flickering weakly. But as I sped away, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the parking lot, watching me. I drove through the night, adrenaline and terror keeping me awake. By the time the sun began to rise, I'd crossed into another state, the dense forests giving way to open plains. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, faint but constant, like a memory that refused to fade. I don't know what these things are or what they want. All I know is they're still with me. In every shadow, in every flicker of light, in every corner of my mind. They're there, waiting, and I can't outrun them. Not forever. By the time the sun was high in the sky, exhaustion had caught up to me. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. I was miles from the motel, miles from the city, but the whispers, they were still there, faint now, like a low static hum in the back of my skull. I couldn't tell if they were coming from outside or inside my mind anymore. I pulled into a roadside diner, a squat, weathered building that looked like it had been forgotten by time. There were a few cars in the lot, their drivers probably enjoying breakfast, unaware of the terror that followed me. I parked as far from the entrance as I could, scanning the lot for anything unusual before stepping out of the car. The diner was a picture of normalcy. The clink of dishes, the hum of conversation, the faint smell of bacon and coffee. For a brief moment, It felt like I'd slipped into a different reality, one where faceless figures and guttural whispers didn't exist. I took a seat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and tried to steady my shaking hands. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile, poured my drink. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice warm but cautious. "Something like that," I muttered, forcing a weak smile. She nodded, her eyes lingering on me for a moment before moving on to another customer. I took a sip of the coffee, its warmth grounding me. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Then I saw the man. He was sitting in a booth at the far end of the diner, his face obscured by the menu he held. Something about him set my nerves on edge. It wasn't just that he was staring at me, though I could feel his gaze even through the menu, but the way he sat perfectly still, as if he were frozen in place. The whispers in my head grew louder, like a warning. I tore my eyes away, focusing on the coffee in front of me. "It's just your paranoia," I told myself. "He's just a guy having breakfast. Get a grip." But when I glanced back, he wasn't there. The booth was empty. The menu lay flat on the table, untouched. My stomach twisted as I scanned the diner, looking for any sign of him. He hadn't passed me to leave, and the door hadn't opened. "Something wrong, Han?" the waitress asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "No," I lied, sliding a few bills onto the counter. "Just in a rush." "Thanks for the coffee." I stepped outside, my heart racing. The parking lot was quiet, the cars undisturbed. But as I approached my car, I saw it, black liquid pooling beneath the rear tires. It gleamed in the sunlight, viscous and unnatural, like the blood of something that didn't belong in this world. The whispers surged in my ears, louder now, almost deafening. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Behind me, the diner door creaked open. I turned, and there he was, the man from the booth. Only now I could see his face, or rather, the absence of one. His head was featureless, smooth as polished stone, and his body moved with that same jerky, unnatural rhythm. He stepped toward me, and I stumbled back, hitting the side of my car. My hands fumbled for the door handle, but the whispers drowned out my thoughts. My vision tunneling as the world around me seemed to twist and warp. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispers stopped. I was alone. The man was gone. The diner door was shut, the lot silent. Even the black liquid had vanished, leaving the pavement dry and unmarked. I climbed into my car, locking the doors and gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay. The faceless figures, the whispers, the strange man. They weren't bound to the city or the hospital. They were following me, playing with me, herding me towards something I couldn't yet see. As I drove, a single thought gnawed at the edges of my mind. A question I'd been too afraid to ask until now. What happens when they finally catch me? The whispers began again as the horizon swallowed the sun, plunging the highway into shadow. They were louder this time, less like voices and more like a relentless droning inside my skull, dragging me toward madness. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, empty save for me and the weight of the unknown. My headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness, and every shadow seemed to shift, to watch, to wait. Then, up ahead, I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as my car came to a halt mere feet from the figure. It was faceless, of course, its blank head turned toward me. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't alone. More of them emerged from the darkness, stepping out of the trees on either side of the road. They moved in jerky, unnatural unison, surrounding my car in a slow, deliberate circle. Panic overtook me. I threw the car into reverse, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, they were there too. Dozens of them, their featureless faces gleaming in the moonlight. There was no escape. The whispers became a roar, filling the car, drowning out my thoughts. My hands gripped the wheel, trembling, and for the first time I screamed. I screamed until my throat burned, until my vision blurred with tears. The figures didn't flinch. They stood still, as if savoring my fear, waiting for something. And then, they moved. One by one, they placed their hands on the car. Cold, rubbery fingers pressed against the windows, the roof, the hood, covering the vehicle like a living skin. The glass frosted over, spiderwebbing with cracks as if the weight of their presence was too much for the world to bear. The car began to shake, the engine sputtering and dying. Inside, the whispers changed. They were words now, clear and unmistakable. spoken in a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt I'd always known. The figures stepped back, leaving the car untouched but broken, as if they were finished with it. They didn't leave, though. Instead, they parted, creating a path that led into the forest. The whispers in my mind grew more insistent, pushing me, urging me forward. My door unlocked with a soft click, the handle cold under my trembling fingers. I didn't want to go, but it didn't matter. My body moved on its own, stepping out of the car and onto the dirt road. The path stretched ahead, lined with motionless figures, their blank faces turned toward me. The whispers became a chant, rhythmic and overpowering, pulling me deeper into the woods. I tried to fight it, but my feet moved as if they were no longer mine, dragging me into the darkness. At the end of the path, I saw it, the machine. It was the same as before, pulsating and alive, its wires and tubes writhing like veins. The figures encircled it, their movements synchronized as they turned toward me. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, the world was silent. Then the machine spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound but a feeling, a vibration deep within my chest, pulling at my very being. It didn't speak words. It communicated something beyond language, a primal command that resonated with every cell in my body. I fell to my knees, unable to move, unable to think. The figures stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. One reached out, its cold, smooth hand pressing against my forehead. The world tilted, spinning out of control as the machine's pulsating glow filled my vision. And then, nothing. I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the highway. The sun was rising, its warm light flooding the interior. My hands were steady, my mind clear. The whispers were gone. The road was empty. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But then I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face stared back at me, blank, featureless, and I smiled.